What were the lessons learned then from not everything went as it should have gone? What do we learn from that?
I think as humans and society, we have a problem dealing with issues that are of low or moderate probability and highly consequential, that occur infrequently. In the 20th century, there were 3 pandemics that killed over 1 million people each, but there were 3, and they weren't every year. We have an outbreak on the scale of Ebola infrequently enough that we don't, in the inter-epidemic period, maintain the vigilance, and we certainly don't maintain the global health governance system, which is deeply flawed. There is no cavalry coming. There are no white hats. There are no trained epidemiologists that are sitting in Geneva or in DC. We have a wonderful group in CDC in Atlanta, but it's nowhere near enough to deal with 1 or 2 outbreaks. What if there are 100, 500? The world hasn't invested in that kind of a system. It's the reinsurance industry, as we talked about earlier, that ultimately bears the cost. It's us as taxpayers and governments that bear the cost of our inability to maintain this kind of a structure. And WHO, and I worked for WHO for 10 years, and everybody who worked for WHO for 10 years has a love-hate relationship with WHO. That's hardly a secret. And WHO was late, and it was slow, and it was inadequate in its response. U.S. government was forceful and strong, but late in our response. Every place you look at, you will find mistakes that were made. Tony was famous for getting on television and calling a spade and saying, we've made mistakes. We should understand that that happens, but it gets magnified in a case where all the things exist as Tony described, that it's a perfect storm. I think the lesson that we have to take away from it is that the pandemic will not be televised. It will not occur at a place that was convenient for us or a time of our choosing. And if we want to be prepared for it, we've got to invest the training, the people, the money, the infrastructure. We've got to create the governance and the institutions. Just like after the Second World War, when the nations came together, we do not want a war again. We don't want a world war again. And we're going to create the institutions that are circuit breakers and buffers. We need to have something that dramatic.
But is the will there? Are the resources there to do that, Neeraj?
So I think part of the lessons and related to resources is we didn't learn from our previous lessons learned. And so we had SARS and we had other diseases, and there was a lot of analysis done and lessons learned from that. But we didn't bring this to the next epidemic. And every time there's an outbreak or an epidemic, it feels like we're digging the well when the fire's on. But the international community has rallied together with leadership from the World Health Organization in the creation of the IHR, the International Health Regulations, which initially was started off to respond to things like smallpox, dengue, and cholera. They've now expanded it to include all diseases, any form of outbreak, including natural disasters. And all the countries have actually signed up to this. In addition to that, the United States, with a few other countries, has set up the Global Health Security GHSA agenda. And that's actually saying, how do we rally around this? Countries like Argentina, for example, have actually proposed this whole notion of white helmets. How do we go in and respond in these sorts of situations? One of the biggest things that most countries have as a resource in terms of mobilizing people to support this, and we saw this in Ebola, is their armies, the armed forces. And so it's that whole notion. So we're starting to see political will and commitment and how we allocate resources to respond to these epidemics. The next time something happens, we'll see how that actually works.
Well,